We continue with the topic understanding the development of the land use planning process. Now we will be looking at an overview of a number of laws and policies that were designed to protect both the natural environment and the built environment. So just by way of reminder, you will recall that there is a distinct difference between laws and policies or regulations. When we talk about laws, we are talking about legislation or acts that have been established and passed at the national level, usually the government level, with a particular objective in mind that requires certain groups and societies to behave in a particular way with a particular objective. Now when we react to an act in a manner that is in violation of those laws, usually associated with that would be penalties, and these penalties may involve fines, they may involve prison time, whereas policies and regulations are designed as guidelines or procedures intended to support the objectives of the laws and legislation. Now we will look briefly at a list of some of the laws that have been put in place with the intention of protecting our natural environment here in Trinidad and Tobago. So we have the environmentally sensitive areas notice. We have the water pollution rules, associated with that the regulations regarding fees. You would be familiar with the Environmental Management Act, the water pollution rules, and some of these other rules are associated with that act, and you can find many of these pieces of legislation available on the Environmental Management Authority website. Additionally, we have other rules associated with the environmentally sensitive areas. We also have legislation regarding the certificate for environmental clearance and its fees, and of course, as most of you should be aware, certificate of environmental clearances would be required by the EMA as part of the requirements for any development in any part of Trinidad and Tobago under the requirements of Town and Country Planning Act, etc. Then we also have the noise pollution rules, and the air pollution, draft air pollution rules, all of which should be available on the EMA website. In addition to local legislation, we have a number of international agreements, conventions, and treaties where we have a number of countries, 2 or more countries, agreeing over how certain aspects of our natural environment should be treated. For example, we have the Basel Convention, which addresses the transboundary movement of hazardous waste. Trinidad and Tobago is party to that as well, and this is particularly important for us due to our heavy reliance on industrial activity in this country, and as a result of that activity, we know a lot of hazardous waste would be produced. We also have the Ramsar Convention, another one that you should be familiar with, which addresses the treatment of wetlands in Trinidad and Tobago. So if you recall, our Nariva Swamp is a Ramsar site, and we have several other wetlands across Trinidad and Tobago that would be governed by this convention as well. We also have a convention on biological diversity, and this convention is intended to conserve our biological diversity and guides the sustainable use of these different biological diversity, etc. We also have the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. This is again also intended to manage the trade of our various species of flora and fauna, and also to protect them from extinction. The Vienna Convention on the Protection of Ozone Layer and its Montreal Protocol on the substances that deplete the ozone layer. So again, this is intended to protect the Earth's ozone layer by managing the use of the various global uses and consumption of ozone depleting substances. There's the Kyoto Protocol, an international agreement that is linked to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Yes, Trinidad and Tobago is also party to this, and it is sets internationally binding agreements on emission reduction targets. And if you recall, most recently, this was one of the areas in which you found the United States current administration actually pulling out of this agreement, the Paris Agreement, and this has caused quite an international uproar. Now, here we have a list of various policies that have been developed in order to facilitate the objectives of many of those laws and agreements that have been listed previously. For example, we have a national environmental policy. We have national policies and programs on wetland conservation in Trinidad and Tobago. We have a national biodiversity plan, national forest policy, national protected areas policies. Yes, we also have a national climate change policy, national tourism policy, and a draft national wildlife policy. So all of these are intended to guide the management of our various natural resources and the natural environment. Now let us look briefly at what is available for the protection of our built environment. So here we are looking at laws. Some of these we would have come across in our previous lesson. The Town and Country Planning Act, we know this is intended to manage the development of land in Trinidad and Tobago, both urban and rural areas. We also have the Planning and Development Land Bill. This is intended to make the physical planning and development control more transparent and to encourage coordination and cooperation among the various government departments. We have the Highways Act that manages our highways, streets and bridges. The Housing Act, this was the act that created the HDC, Housing Development Corporation, that manages the dealing with housing, etc. There's the Caribbean Building Code, which is still in development. At this point, we still don't have a national building code. To the best of my knowledge, that also is still in development. So the Caribbean Development Code is a comprehensive set of national building standards, thereby facilitating the safe and economical designs of buildings in the region. And this is a critical piece of legislation for us to have, because if you recall, we previously noted that Trinidad and Tobago, our geographic location puts us right in the middle of a high-risk area for tectonic hazards. Then we also have the State Land Regularization of Tenure Act, which is designed to protect certain squatters from ejectment from state lands, to facilitate the acquisition of leasehold titles by both squatters and tenants in designated areas. Plans to protect the built environment include the National Physical Development Plan. Now this plan is an old plan and it had not been updated as was intended. It has been replaced as would have been mentioned in a previous lesson, by the National Spatial Development Strategy. We also have municipal development plans, where individual spatial development plans are created for each of our 14 municipalities. Those are our regional corporations. We have the Land Acquisition Act, which is intended to manage the acquisition of land for public purposes. And then there is also the Northern Range Hillside Development Policy, because we have an intense amount of urban development occurring along the east-west corridor in the foothills of the Northern Range. Please note, many of these laws, plans, and policies, the information was gathered from the Preliminary Vulnerability Assessment of Trinidad and Tobago document. So let's look briefly at an analysis of these various laws and regulations. What exactly is its status? How well is it working? There is an obvious need for greater guidance on management of the built environment. There are a number of obvious gaps in regulations, as I mentioned before, the absence of local building codes. There's a need for updating and review of much of these laws and policies to ensure that new data and major issues, particularly disaster management issues and risk reduction, are properly addressed into these various plans, policies, and legislations. Because currently what is happening is many of these laws and policies that exist today are out of date, and they need to be updated. Penalties are often too minor in order to deter transgression. When you have penalties at a few $100s, for many of these people, that's not going to cause them to think twice about violating the laws. Monitoring and enforcement of the laws and policies in Trinidad and Tobago is also very weak. In many cases, is not at all. And what you find is many offenses go unnoticed because the responsible agencies do not have adequate resources, such as qualified staff or even the number of staff necessary in order to monitor and enforce the policies and the laws. There is also an immense amount of public ignorance of legislation. So people would often not even recognize or know that they are in violation of national laws. There are other risks involved in the land use planning process. For example, we have increasing settlement in high-risk zones across Trinidad and Tobago. So where we have a lot of rural-urban migration taking place, people moving from the rural areas into the urban areas. When this happens, we have increased urbanization taking place. We have an increasing amount of settlements occurring in marginal areas, such as the hillsides, which would be vulnerable to landslides, settlements developing in floodplains, and also nearby industrial areas. All of these being high-risk areas. An example of this would be the Marabella fence line communities in South Trinidad that surround the Petrotrin oil refinery. So you have squatter settlements developing near an industrial site, as well as the small communities of staff homes, which are also really at risk within the compound itself. And these communities, as you can imagine, they are subject to hazards from spills, leaks, fires, and explosion because of their proximity to the refineries. There is also an increase in the number of households that is associated with increasing urbanization in all the municipalities across Trinidad and Tobago, except for Port of Spain and San Fernando, where what is actually happening is a certain amount of inertia has taken place. not much growth can continue because these two major urban areas have already experienced constraints due to the existing building intensity as well as limited space. Remember, Trinidad and Tobago, we are island states. We are small island states. And as mentioned before, land space is limited. So there comes a time very soon in the development of some of these urban areas where further spatial expansion becomes impossible. And many of the high-risk households on the marginal lands, as you can imagine, would be illegal. What is actually happening is squatting. And associated with squatting and these illegal settlements, you find that that is associated with poor infrastructure. And where you have poor infrastructure, you have an increased risk of public health hazards. Other risks that can create a land use planning challenge is where you have unsustainable practices occurring in high-risk areas. For example, quarrying. At present in Trinidad, there are 69 active quarries, combination of both public and private quarries, where 31 of these provide sand and gravel to the construction industry. And in particular, around that period, 2006 to 7, there was an increase in the construction sector. And where you have an increase in the construction sector, the demand for aggregates would increase, thereby causing quarrying activities to increase and putting further stress on the natural environment. Some of the effects on the environment can be the effects on our natural forests and wildlife sanctuaries, not only in terms of the deforestation, but also in terms of natural habitats being destroyed. Watercourses can be affected, where you have a lot of flooding and siltation occurring from the quarrying. Nearby communities can be affected not only by the noise but also a lot of air pollution. Quarrying can also contribute to slope instability, leading to an increased risk of landslides, as already mentioned before, deforestation. Abandoned quarries can also become a problem, for they can actually collect water and create breeding ground for mosquitoes. Again, another possible public health hazard in the making. But it's also important to note that quarries need to receive approval before they can operate. So in order to manage the activity, just as with any kind of development, quarrying is considered a development of land. So the appropriate approvals from town and country planning, the many times also the certificate of environmental clearance from Environmental Management Authority would be required. Then we also have deforestation and removal of mangroves occurring across Trinidad and Tobago. During the period 1990 to 2000, Trinidad and Tobago lost an average of 7 square kilometers of forest per year. This amounts to a deforestation rate of 0.3%. So for a small island state like Trinidad and Tobago, that is a lot of forest loss. Despite their importance and the relevant regulations in place for their protection, mangroves are also being threatened by encroaching development. For example, we have the municipality of Diego Martin, which was very heavily impacted by flooding and landslides in 2013. Much of this has been attributed to flooding that was triggered by the combination of not only intense rainfall but by the elimination of huge mangroves that naturally occurred nearby. Additionally, we have the capacity of our natural and man-made drainage channels being compromised. Where we have increasing urbanization, there is also an increased strain on our drainage system, as mentioned, both the natural drainage system network, our overland hydrological networks, as well as man-made drainage channels. And this is further being compromised by the dumping of garbage and debris in those channels, which block the waterways, causing the buildup of water and sediments to overflow its banks into natural areas and in built communities. So both the natural and man-made waterways need to be properly maintained and regularly maintained, particularly prior to the rainy season. You cannot wait until the rain begins to fall to try to carry out mitigation measures. And so these are some of the challenges that we face in Trinidad and Tobago with regards to proper land use planning. So at this point, I want to thank you for joining me for this week's lesson. You are please asked to proceed to the activities that have been made available for this week. Thank you.